There's a conversation you keep going back to. Maybe it was an argument that ended badly. A moment where someone said something that shouldn't have landed as hard as it did. But it did. A conversation that closed without resolution, without apology, without the thing you were waiting for. And even though weeks have passed, maybe months, some part of your mind is still in that room, still replaying, still rearranging the words, still trying to find the version of events that finally makes sense. Most people think of this as a problem, a sign of overthinking, a habit the mind needs to break. But what if it isn't a glitch? What if the mind keeps returning to that conversation, not because something is wrong with you, but because you are quietly grieving something you haven't yet allowed yourself to name? That is what this video is about. Not how to stop the replay, but what the replay is actually trying to tell you, and why understanding that changes everything. Think about how many conversations you have in a single week. With colleagues, with family, with strangers, with friends. Dozens of interactions, hundreds of exchanges. Most of them vanish almost immediately, forgotten before the day is even over. But then there are the others. The ones that don't vanish. The ones that follow you. That show up uninvited at 2 a.m. when the room is quiet and there's nothing left to distract you from them. What makes these conversations different? It isn't the length. It isn't even the intensity. The conversations we replay are almost always the ones where something was left unresolved. Not just intellectually, but emotionally. Something happened in that exchange that the mind registered as incomplete, unfinished, still open. Psychologists call this the Zeigarnik effect, the brain's tendency to hold unfinished things in active memory far more tightly than completed ones. The mind, by design, doesn't abandon open loops. It returns to them again and again until they close. But here's what most explanations of the Zeigarnik effect miss entirely. The loop the mind is trying to close isn't always about the conversation. Sometimes it's about something the conversation took from you. This is the layer most people never reach because it requires a kind of honesty that is quietly uncomfortable. When we replay an old conversation, we tell ourselves we're trying to understand what happened. We're looking for clarity, for logic, for the explanation that will finally make it make sense. But look more carefully at what the mind actually does during the replay. It doesn't just re-examine, it mourns. It mourns the version of the relationship you thought you had before that conversation showed you something different. It mourns the image of yourself you were carrying before someone's words cracked it. It mourns the sense of being understood, valued, or seen that the conversation quietly took away. We don't replay conversations because we're obsessing over words. We replay them because something we cared about was lost in that exchange, and we haven't yet grieved it properly. The rejection that told you that you matter less than you thought. The silence that revealed a distance you hadn't wanted to see. The argument that showed you a side of someone you can never unsee. These aren't just uncomfortable memories. They are small losses. And like all losses, they need to be mourned, not just analyzed. The mind keeps returning because grief that is unacknowledged doesn't disappear. It waits. Here's something worth noticing about yourself. When a difficult conversation won't leave you alone, what do you do with it? Most people analyze, They pick apart the words, they reconstruct the timeline, they build theories about what the other person meant, what they missed, what they should have done differently. They turn the emotional experience into an intellectual puzzle. And there's a reason for this. Analysis feels productive. It feels like you're doing something with the pain, making sense of it, solving it, moving toward resolution. But often, analysis is actually a sophisticated way of avoiding grief. Because grief asks something harder of us than analysis does. Grief asks us to stop looking for what went wrong and simply feel what was lost. To sit with the absence of something we wanted. To acknowledge, quietly and honestly, that something hurt, not because we misunderstood it, but because it genuinely mattered to us. The Buddhist concept of dukkha, often translated as suffering, refers not just to pain, but to a particular kind of unsatisfactoriness that arises when we resist experiencing things as they actually are, when we keep reaching for a reality that no longer exists. Every time we replay a conversation hoping for a different outcome, we are living inside dukkha. We are suffering not from the original wound, but from our refusal to let it be a wound. There is one more layer, and it may be the most important one. Not every replay is purely about grief. Some replays are asking a deeper question, one that has very little to do with the other person. What does this say about me? Certain conversations shake something in us that goes beyond the exchange itself. They touch something older, a belief we carry about our own worth, our own lovability, our own place in the world. And when a conversation threatens that belief, the mind doesn't just grieve the loss of the relationship or the moment. It goes to work on the deeper wound. If they could speak to me that way, what does that mean about who I am? If I couldn't defend myself, what does that say about my strength? If I still care this much, what does that reveal about what I need? These questions are not signs of weakness. They are the mind doing the most honest work it knows how to do, trying to understand not just what happened out there, but what it exposed in here. The replay, at its deepest level, is an invitation towards self-knowledge. The tragedy is that most people never accept that invitation. They stay on the surface, in the analysis, in the rehearsed responses, in the endless reconstruction of events, and never go deep enough to hear what the conversation is actually trying to tell them about themselves. So let's return to what we asked at the beginning. Why does the mind keep going back, even when you know, rationally, that the conversation is over? Here is the answer. Because you are grieving, and the grief hasn't finished yet. Not necessarily grieving the relationship, or the person, or even the conversation itself, but grieving something quieter, the version of reality you were living in before that exchange, the sense of being understood that it disturbed, the image of yourself that it unsettled. And grief, real grief, cannot be resolved by analysis. It cannot be thought through. It can only be moved through by acknowledging, honestly and without judgment, that something genuinely hurt, that something genuinely mattered, that a loss occurred, however small it might appear from the outside.
The next time that conversation arrives uninvited, instead of reaching immediately for the better comeback, the sharper explanation, the theory of what went wrong, try sitting with a different question. What did I lose in that moment? And have I allowed myself to actually feel that loss? Not to dwell, not to suffer more deeply, but to finally give the grief what it has been asking for: your honest attention. Because here's what I've come to understand about the mind. It is extraordinarily loyal. It will hold the door open on a painful memory for months, for years if necessary. Not to punish you, but because it knows that something in there still needs your care. The replay ends not when you find the perfect words. It ends when you finally turn toward what was lost and allow yourself to grieve it. That is the wisdom the conversation was carrying all along. And it was never about the other person. It was always about you and your willingness to truly know yourself.